What you aren't being told about the Middle East's real crisis. The Middle East is on the brink of collapse, and it's not just the wars you should worry about. Every major conflict in the Middle East has its roots in something deeper. It's not just about the wars, the militias, or even the oil. It's about ideological battles that could push the entire region over the edge. Could these hidden tensions ignite the next global crisis? Let's dive deep into the forces shaping the Middle East and why you should care about what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button to follow this eye-opening journey. Leave a like and hit the notification bell so we will not miss out on each other, as we will always love to be your companion. The Middle East, a region with a history that spans thousands of years, is known for its ancient civilizations, rich culture, and immense geopolitical power. But in the present day, the region is facing a collapse. Wars have ravaged cities, ideologies have divided nations, and now, more than ever, the region's stability is being put to the test. But here's the catch. It's not just the wars and conflicts you see in the news that pose the greatest risk. No, the true danger lies in the environmental crisis that's quietly brewing beneath the surface. A threat that could push this region and the entire world into uncharted territory. Today, we're going to uncover the real, hidden forces that are shaping the Middle East's future. This isn't just about oil or weapons or religious divisions. It's about survival. The survival of nations, ecosystems, and economies. From the drying rivers of Iraq to the looming water shortages in Egypt, this is a story of how climate change, resource scarcity, and political failure could combine to create the perfect storm. And here's the scariest part. This isn't something that will happen decades from now. This is happening right now. It's already unfolding, and it's far more dangerous than any military conflict. In this video, we'll reveal how the Middle East's future hinges on forces more powerful than anything we've seen in history. What if I told you that the wars in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq are just the visible tip of the iceberg? Sure, these conflicts are devastating, but there's something much bigger at play, something much more dangerous. The real crisis is the one that you can't see. A collapsing environment, exploding populations, and the scramble for resources that are running out faster than ever. Let's be honest, the headlines focus on military conquests, rebel forces, and territorial claims. But the reality is that these wars are merely the symptom, not the cause. The true threat isn't coming from the battlefield, it's coming from beneath the earth, from the skies, and from the rivers that have been the lifeblood of the Middle East for centuries. Imagine a region where water sources are drying up, temperatures are rising to deadly levels, and the very lands that sustained ancient empires are becoming uninhabitable. Picture millions of people fighting over food, water, and energy. Picture nations driven to their breaking point because the resources they once took for granted are now scarce. This isn't some far-off dystopian future, it's happening today, and it could change the world as we know it. Let's start by talking about water. You think it's an issue that only affects arid regions in Africa, don't you? But the Middle East, already the driest region on Earth, is facing a water crisis that could rival anything humanity has faced in modern history. Think about it. The rivers that have nourished Iraq for millennia, the Nile that sustains Egypt, and the Euphrates that runs through Syria, they're all drying up. And these countries are fighting each other over the last drops of water. But that's just the beginning. Let's dive deeper. In this section, we'll focus on the growing environmental collapse in the Middle East. When you think about the region, you probably think about desert landscapes, ancient ruins, and vast stretches of sand. But there's so much more to it. The Middle East's environment is fragile, and it's crumbling faster than we realize. Let's start with water. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which have supported civilizations for millennia, are drying up. And it's not just because of natural causes. These rivers are being diverted, dammed, and overused. Take Turkey, for instance. The country's massive dam projects, including the Ilisu Dam on the Tigris, have been heavily criticized for drastically reducing the flow of water downstream to Iraq and Syria. Now imagine Iraq, one of the world's oldest civilizations, facing a chronic water shortage. The country's agriculture, once thriving in the Fertile Crescent, is being wiped out by drought and the lack of irrigation. And it's not just Iraq. Syria, too, has been facing massive shortages of water, which has contributed to the conflict there. The situation is dire, with food security and livelihoods at risk. Then there's climate change. The Middle East is warming up faster than any other region on Earth. In cities like Baghdad, Kuwait City, and Cairo, temperatures are soaring to levels where human life can't survive without air conditioning. In Iraq, summer temperatures can easily hit 50 degrees Celsius, 102 degrees Celsius. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's deadly. The region is becoming increasingly uninhabitable, and this has far-reaching consequences for migration, agriculture, and stability. Food scarcity is another issue, exacerbated by climate change. As crops fail due to water shortages and rising temperatures, food prices rise and supply chains become more fragile. Countries that rely on imported food like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon will see massive shortages. Egypt, for instance, imports nearly 70% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. If conflicts in these regions persist, or if Russia's war on Ukraine further disrupts supply chains, the Middle East could face catastrophic food insecurity. Energy scarcity is another crucial factor that needs our attention. The Middle East is an oil-rich region, but what happens when oil prices fall or when global markets shift to renewable energy sources? Oil-dependent economies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are already feeling the pinch as renewable energy becomes a greater global priority. But the transition to sustainable energy is slow, and these economies are facing difficult choices as their wealth from oil begins to dry up. The population of the Middle East is exploding. In countries like Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, millions of people live in refugee camps or are displaced. With fewer resources and more people, tensions between nations and within nations are at an all-time high. The desperate fight for survival has led to increasingly violent conflicts. This will only worsen if the environmental crisis isn't addressed. The Middle East's environmental crisis is a ticking time bomb. Nations are already fighting over water, and as temperatures rise and resources become even scarcer, it's only a matter of time before the situation escalates further. Now, let's take a deeper dive into the critical issues that are worsening the Middle East's crisis. This isn't just a simple matter of war. It's the backdrop of a much larger, slower-moving disaster, which involves natural resources, economies, and political instability all converging at once. These are the issues that could potentially lead the region and the entire world to a tipping point. Let's begin by understanding how these factors are intertwined. We've already discussed the water crisis briefly, but we need to go deeper into just how critical this issue is. Water in the Middle East is already a scarce resource, and the situation is becoming unsustainable. As mentioned earlier, rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, which once sustained ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, are rapidly drying up. But this isn't just due to natural causes. Take the Euphrates River, for example. Once the lifeblood of the region, providing irrigation and fresh water to millions in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, it's been heavily dammed by Turkey. The Ilisu Dam, which controls the flow of the Euphrates, has caused massive water shortages downstream in both Iraq and Syria. For Iraq, the loss of water is not only an environmental issue, but a political one too. The lack of water threatens the agricultural heart of the country and leaves its people in an increasingly vulnerable position. This could be the trigger for future conflicts. The very fabric of society, already weakened by years of conflict, could collapse under the pressure of such a crisis. Now think about the Nile River, which sustains Egypt, providing water for 95% of its population. But Egypt's relationship with Ethiopia, who has built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, ERD, on the Blue Nile, has become increasingly tense. While Ethiopia claims it's developing the dam for power generation, Egypt fears the dam will drastically reduce the water flow to its own country. This disagreement over water resources has escalated into high-stakes diplomatic tensions, and some even warn it could lead to military conflict. When you add to this the failing infrastructure in many parts of the region, decades of underinvestment, outdated systems, and a lack of proper water management, the situation becomes even more dire. And this isn't just about irrigation. This is about drinking water, which is a fundamental need. As the Middle East's fresh water supply continues to shrink, the battle for water will become a key flashpoint. Cities may become uninhabitable as groundwater is depleted, and desperate migration will only intensify. Now on to climate change. The Middle East is experiencing some of the fastest rates of warming in the world. Some studies suggest that the region will be more than 2 degrees Celsius hotter by 2050 than it was in the 1950s. This extreme heat is causing a cascade of problems. Not only does it reduce crop yields and make life unbearable in many urban areas, but it's also placing immense pressure on already fragile infrastructure. For instance, Iraq has seen temperatures regularly exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, especially in the summer months. Such heat means that outdoor work becomes impossible during the hottest parts of the day. For agricultural nations already struggling with water shortages, these extreme temperatures further compound the problem. While many countries in the West and other parts of the world have the resources to adapt, the Middle East, with its limited access to resources and growing populations, cannot afford to simply wait out climate change. What's even more concerning is the likelihood of dust storms becoming more frequent. These storms are not only a threat to health, but also have the potential to bring toxic dust into cities, further diminishing air quality and exacerbating respiratory illnesses. This phenomenon is a result of desertification, another consequence of the changing climate. And desertification itself is accelerating, contributing to the shrinking of agricultural land across the region. The Middle East, once known for its fertile crescent, is turning into a vast desert. In cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, heat waves have already made life unbearable for many. And it's not just about discomfort. Heat stress leads to higher mortality rates, especially for the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions. Hospitals are overwhelmed during the peak of summer months. This means that not only is the region facing an environmental collapse, but public health systems are also under significant strain. The Middle East is often thought of as a region dominated by its oil reserves. But what happens when those reserves start to deplete? The Middle East holds a significant portion of the world's oil reserves, but the shift towards renewable energy is making the region's economies look increasingly vulnerable. As countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE slowly transition away from oil, they're still largely dependent on it for their economic stability. But oil prices are volatile. They can fluctuate wildly based on global demand, supply chains, and geopolitical tensions. At the same time, these countries are trying to shift to green energy, investing in solar power and wind farms. But these industries are still in the early stages of development. The transition to a post-oil economy is slow, and it will take decades before renewable energy can replace oil as the main economic driver. This prolonged period of uncertainty leaves the region vulnerable to economic shocks. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which aims to diversify its economy, is a start. But what happens when oil becomes a declining asset? Countries that were once flush with wealth may find themselves unable to meet the demands of their growing populations. This could lead to economic instability, rising unemployment, and civil unrest. But oil isn't the only resource under threat. Food security is a rapidly growing issue. The Middle East has long struggled with food insecurity, and with the growing climate crisis, this issue is intensifying. As crop yields decline due to extreme weather and a lack of fresh water, the region is increasingly dependent on food imports. Egypt, for instance, relies heavily on imports for wheat, much of which comes from Ukraine and Russia. The ongoing Ukraine crisis has disrupted these vital supplies, leading to an increase in food prices and a growing hunger crisis in some countries. In Yemen, where the war has led to the collapse of basic infrastructure, food is scarce, and millions are facing famine. This has created a humanitarian disaster, and as the war continues to drag on, the crisis deepens. Saudi Arabia, which leads a coalition in Yemen, is also facing food insecurity, as the war's consequences ripple back into the kingdom. The region is vulnerable because it cannot produce enough food to feed its populations, and the situation will only worsen as water resources decline. This will increase social unrest, particularly in countries with large populations but limited resources. Nations will be forced to make difficult choices. Will they feed their own people, or will they engage in geopolitical conflicts over access to water and food? Finally, let's talk about population growth. The Middle East is one of the fastest growing regions in the world in terms of population. The youth population is growing at an alarming rate, but the region lacks the resources to provide adequate jobs, healthcare, or education. As populations swell, so too does the pressure on government systems that are already weak or fragile. Youth unemployment in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan has reached critical levels, leading to political instability. Disillusioned young people are increasingly turning to extremist ideologies or violent means to express their frustrations. When a country's population exceeds its ability to sustain it, things begin to fall apart. And the Middle East, where many economies are already struggling, is feeling this pressure more than ever. Migration within the region is already on the rise, with people fleeing drought-stricken areas and war-torn countries for better opportunities elsewhere. But where can they go? The options are limited, and the rise of xenophobia and nationalism in many countries is making migration harder. The Middle East may be on the brink of collapse, but it doesn't have to be. If the region can adapt to its changing environment, cooperate across borders, and embrace renewable energy and technological innovation, there's a future beyond war and disaster. But it will take bold leadership, international cooperation, and a willingness to put survival above political or ideological divides. This is a wake-up call for the world. The Middle East's environmental crisis is not just the region's problem, it's a global issue, and it's time for the world to act. The clock is ticking, and the time to act is now. You've just seen how the Middle East's future is tied to its environmental crisis, and how that crisis could reshape the world as we know it. We've explored the risks, the problems, and most importantly, the solutions. It's clear that action must be taken now before it's too late. The time to act is now, and if you want to stay informed, if you want to help make a difference, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think the Middle East can overcome these challenges? Let's start a global conversation. I will contribute first and get your views in the comment section. In my opinion, the key lies in cooperation, investment in technology, and global leadership. If there's one thing that could turn the tide, it's cooperation. We've seen time and time again that the Middle East's conflicts often stem from an inability to cooperate across borders. But what if the region's countries, instead of fighting each other over resources, worked together to ensure survival for all? Imagine a regional coalition between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, united by the need to address the environmental crisis. If these nations could come together to share water resources, develop sustainable agricultural practices, and invest in renewable energy projects, they could create a blueprint for other parts of the world struggling with climate change. For instance, shared water management would allow for equitable distribution of resources. Countries could build joint infrastructure projects for irrigation, water recycling, and desalination. These technologies already exist, but their implementation has been slow due to political tensions. If countries like Iraq and Syria could share access to water from the Tigris and Euphrates, they could avoid a catastrophic conflict over water resources. Next, we need to talk about technological innovation. The Middle East has the potential to become a leader in renewable energy. The region's vast deserts are perfect for solar energy production. And countries like the UAE have already started investing heavily in solar farms. However, the investments need to go beyond pilot projects and scale up rapidly. Saudi Arabia, in particular, has already launched its Vision 2030 plan, which includes a massive transition to renewable energy. If these plans are executed successfully, the Middle East could become a powerhouse in clean energy. Not only would this reduce dependence on oil, but it would also create a sustainable source of power for the region's growing population. Investing in technology, the solar revolution. One of the most promising solutions to the Middle East's environmental crisis is the region's vast potential for solar power. The Middle East is known for its extreme sun exposure, making it an ideal candidate for solar energy. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt have already begun investing in large-scale solar farms. But what if this investment could be taken to the next level? Imagine a solar network that spans the entire region, pooling resources to create a unified power grid powered entirely by solar energy. This would reduce dependency on oil and gas while creating sustainable, renewable energy. It could also provide job opportunities and infrastructure development to the region's growing population. If the Middle East became a leader in solar energy, it would not only help with the region's energy crisis, but also serve as a global energy powerhouse, exporting solar energy to neighboring regions. The infrastructure investment needed to make this a reality is enormous, but the region has the wealth and the resources to do it. To address the water crisis, desalination technology could become a game changer. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait are already heavily investing in desalination plants, which turn seawater into drinkable water. But there's a catch. Desalination is expensive and energy-intensive. If the region could combine desalination with solar power, the environmental impact could be mitigated and water could become more accessible. The key here is regional collaboration. By sharing desalination technologies and water management strategies, countries in the region could ensure that every nation has access to water. Additionally, water conservation methods such as better irrigation systems, water recycling, and efficient use of existing resources could help alleviate the pressure on dwindling water supplies. Finally, international support is essential. The international community must step in to help the Middle East. Countries like the United States, Russia, China, and the European Union have a vested interest in ensuring the stability of the region. It's not just about humanitarian aid. It's about creating a global framework for addressing climate change and resource management. Now your turn. What do you think is the biggest threat to the Middle East's future right now? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced or seen any impact of environmental changes in the Middle East? Share your story with us. What do you think needs to be done to prevent an environmental collapse in the region? Drop your advice below in the comment section. I'd love to hear different perspectives. Thank you for your contributions.